Hello and welcome to On Point. I'm Lauren Turner Dunn. Claim after claim, the sexual harassment and misconduct allegations just keep coming. Title VII recognizes two types of sexual harassment. One is a hostile work environment. The other is called quid pro quo, meaning asking employees for sexual favors in exchange for advancement. Harassers can be anyone. Recently, many public figures have been accused of unlawful behavior, including people in politics, the food industry, and the media. We asked people at CSUN what their thoughts are about the issue.
Like, men may have that entitlement over women, that they can speak to them however they want and it be taken as a joke.
I don't think it's right for people with power to, abuse that as a means to get their pleasures taken care of.
As a woman, it's often that, you go to work and it's just one of those things you keep your mind out for and you keep a lookout for, and it's unfortunate.
I'd say speak out, look for help, don't keep it to yourself.
On Point's Heather Ann Wagner has more on the story.
Thank you, Lauren. I'd like to welcome my guest joining me today, Betsy Butler, who's the director of the California Women's Law Center, Jennifer Berry, who is the CSUN Gender and Women's Study Professor, and Susan Hua, CSUN Title IX Coordinator. Let's start with you, Betsy. What is the difference between sexual harassment and sexual misconduct?
It does go to injury. I think the bigger question is, do people know when they've committed either one of those infractions? And you can have, conversations you think very innocently that are quite dangerous and injurious. So obviously, if you're holding people against their will or in any way not getting consent from them and things are happening, take the Brock Turner situation up at Stanford, obviously that's quite injurious, but there can be much more frivolous conversations that are also very dangerous.
And this is to everyone. Are women the only victims, or can men be the victims as well?
I mean, men can be victims as well, but the majority of victims are women. But I have heard countless accounts from young men, and it's usually about, again, coming back to the power imbalance. So many young men have those experiences as well.
And speaking of power, do accusations against high-profile men help victims come forward now and give them a voice and help them fight against sexual harassment in the workplace?
I think it's definitely a watershed moment. I think we are all having a moment right now, whether a survivor is male, female, whatever the gender identity is. I think people are breaking the silence, and there are several things going on, whether it's the media and you're seeing sports figures, or you're seeing politicians and men in powerful positions being held accountable for sexual harassment and sexual misconduct. I think it's really giving not only a voice through social media and technology and how that's impacting this movement, but also allowing people who might not have spoken up years ago, and not necessarily a recent event, to feel that now that there's support for them.
I think too, there's a lot of victims are embarrassed or don't want to come forward, but whether it's campus sexual assault or the priest abuse scandals, when others come forward and said, well, that same person did something to me, then they don't feel as guilty a lot of times. They feel like they're more supported. And the work that we do, a lot of women have come forward since the Bill Cosby stuff, because all of a sudden, men like that who were just beloved in this country obviously had a problem. And I talked to several women who've kept this information to themselves for 40, 50 years, but now feel like coming out. And more than that, they're ready to make change happen. And it starts with policing. It's so many levels of action that needs to take place now, and mindset changes here in this country. It's a different culture that we need to look at.
And one of the things I always say at the beginning of my semester and everyone in my classes is that I say to all of these women students, females and male allies too, I say every part of the oppression of women is that we think we're alone, and that we think our personal difficulties or our harassment stories or whatever are individual, and they never are. And usually by the end of the semester, I have all of the female students and the male allies talking with each other. And I think this is what the Me Too has done,
Absolutely.
is that you are not alone.
Nope.
Not only are you not alone, we're building an army. And that's what I really believe, is that we are building an army of women that are saying, this will not continue in my lifetime. We don't want it for our daughters, and we don't want it for ourselves.
Do women use this power to potentially accuse a man of wrongdoing, maybe incorrectly now, since they're kind of placed and accused in a way without due process?
The studies we've seen show that any false accusations fall on the same percentage of any other crime that's falsely reported, and it's about 2 or 3%, and that's it. And that's true with every crime. And sexual harassment, assault, and rape seem to fall in that exact same percentage.
I think that's also why it's important to have policies in place. I'm going to share a personal story, since this is sort of a personal topic for me. I was sexually harassed by a teacher in high school, and at that time, a teacher could be with a student behind a closed door. That if you were getting extra help from a teacher, he could close the door and have his way with you. And now, after I reported it, this was back in the late 80s, I reported it, and I was not helped. But 5 years later, when my brother told the administration that what had happened to me, and he was a very successful athlete at our same school, they developed and listened to him and listened to many other women that had come forward at that time. They established an open door policy that no teacher could be behind a closed door with a student. That didn't prevent, every abuse, but there was a policy in place to protect young people from possible abuse and sexual misconduct.
This will be to Susan. How is something like sexual harassment handled on a campus?
So here at CSUN, they would come to our office. It would be reported or disclosed to the Title IX office. And so we have done extensive training with both our students and employees, making sure that students know who they can go to as confidential resources here on campus, and it's usually our counselors, our mental health advisors, and our victims advocate on campus. And we also have people who are mandated to report, and that's generally our professors and other staff who don't have privileges, right? And so knowing the different resources they can access on campus, I think we are seeing definitely an increase of survivors who feel that they are ready to talk about their experiences as they're continuing to process their experiences, to get help and to hold individuals accountable, especially if there's still individuals here on campus. So that kind of knowledge and awareness around the resources for support, but also knowing that there's levels of accountability where if they disclose to a faculty member or an academic advisor, they'd get it to our office to be able to respond in some way. And of course, we work with campus police. If they decide to file a criminal complaint, all these things can happen at once because it's a real coordinated effort here. And I think that universities across the nation are really ramping up their efforts to have these kinds of systems in place.
Speaking of criminal, Betsy, what makes a claim criminal? What takes it from the harassment to actually having a legal claim?
Well, harassment can be illegal too. It really is the level. I mean, a good lawyers, also campus advocates, can help you decide what has happened and how you want to go forward with it, depending upon what's necessary. I mean, a lot of people now get lawyers and pro bono lawyers, so you don't necessarily have to pay for your legal services. But it really is important to, if you've been injured, to talk about it to law enforcement and legal counsel, so you can figure out your best steps forward.
Thank you. Jennifer, how does gender play a role in sexual harassment?
Well, we know that women are more often harassed than men, but as I said earlier, that, it happens to men too. I think It's really about power imbalance and who has the power in the situation that the person that's being harassed is in.
Thank you. Susan, what proof is required in, say, a he said, she said case in order to make a claim?
Yeah, in every one of our reviews and investigations, we look at credibility determinations. So we look at word versus word, right? And that's required in everything that we look at. In terms of what's proof, our threshold for finding a violation of our policy, that's very different than looking on the legal front or the criminal or dealing with a criminal case, is preponderance of the evidence. So more likely than not, if we feel that the facts substantiate an allegation, then we'll find a violation. That's very different in the criminal realm where it's beyond a reasonable doubt. So we look at everything, anything that's relevant, including witness statements, any documentation. We've been seeing an uptick in things like text messages, things that people post on social media that might give us some insight into the incidents surrounding the allegations. So it's a whole range of things, but we definitely do credibility determinations as to whether someone might have a motive to fabricate something or just, whether something's plausible at all or makes sense. And we, especially with sexual assault cases, really take into account the fact that how trauma might affect someone's recall of events and things like that. So we're definitely trained in thinking about those considerations.
I will go Betsy. At what point does someone seek legal advice for sexual harassment or misconduct, and have you seen it change since all of this has occurred?
Yes, that's what I mentioned. I mean, this is such a movement, and I think women and young women are feeling more supported, and there's still a lot of women who come to me and tell me the situation for me to just share with other people to use in documentaries, even in books. They don't ever want their name used. They don't want the offender mentioned or named. They don't want the offense itself. They just want people to know this happened. And use what I went through to make the cause better, to solve these problems, to address these problems. And so it's a time, some women will never come forward, and some women will, as I said, take 40 or 50 years, and some will report the next day. A lot of these situations are people that they know, and so they have to grapple, victims have to grapple with, whether they want to bring all that out in the open. These aren't generally strangers, particularly on campus, who have assaulted them or harassed them.
And Jennifer, do you think workplace dynamic maybe plays a role in people not speaking out or not feeling empowered to do it?
I think absolutely. I mean, it also depends on what kind of jobs we're talking about. A hotel maid is going to be less able to speak up, especially if she's an immigrant. There are, and that's an issue that we really need to talk about too with race, class, and gender, is that, a lot of the people that started the Me Too movement and the people that brought down Harvey Weinstein, these were all women that also had an incredible amount of power. There are women that have no power, that are barely getting by, and it is much more difficult for them to step up and speak out.
Thank you. Yeah.
If I may add, I think we see that in the student context
Absolutely.
as well, right?
Yes.
So when we think about students who might have come from more privileged backgrounds and have family support at home, versus some students, for instance, CSUN is such a diverse community, and we have undocumented students who may not want to be on the radar, even though they have been victimized, to bring something forward because of other implications. Or we have cultural differences in which someone from, for example, an Asian culture might feel like, I can't talk about it because that's airing my dirty laundry and bringing shame to my family. And there's that victim blaming aspect that we talked about earlier. So all these things are considerations when we think about whether someone feels comfortable, supported coming forward heard strength in numbers. We're seeing, you know, those who are being accused, multiple women are coming out and finally being believed. But imagine you have one woman who feels isolated and, like you said earlier, Jennifer, and feeling like, was I the only one? Right. Did I bring this on myself? And so this is really a moment to talk about what behaviors we're going to continue to accept, right? And I think people have talked about it in the media as well, about generational differences. Maybe 30 years ago, someone thought in the workplace that was okay, and that was just a misunderstanding, and now perhaps a new generation is feeling like, no, absolutely not. There is a brighter line than may have been perceived before.
Absolutely. That brings up another question of, is it usually when you find there's one victim, there's multiple? Like we're seeing go on right now, like one person accused Harvey Weinstein and we find out there were multiple victims. Is that generally the case? Anyone can answer.
Well, I feel like if someone doesn't get checked along the way in terms of perpetrating harassment or, you know, and feeling as if what they're doing is acceptable, then, you know, more likely than not, they're going to continue those kinds of behaviors when there's no accountability or little accountability.
Yeah, I think sexual predators have these patterns that keep playing out and playing out. I had an interesting thing happen in one of my classes a couple semesters ago where, you know, I got the students talking about any time they had experienced sexual harassment on the job, and they had all talked about working at this particular retail store, and they kept transferring this manager that was sexual harassing all these different young women. And four of them had all had the same manager. He had just been, you know, transferred along, and he kept predatoring, you know, he kept acting out his predator patterns towards new individuals, new women. So, you know, whether one comes forward or 1,000 come forward, usually that is a compulsion that they keep running until they get caught.
Yeah, I mean, you know, the rule, if you don't think the rules apply to you, yeah. I think a lot of it comes from parenting too. Just teaching respect for one another, and especially young people. There are a number of organizations now that are teaching, you know, women young girls, what is appropriate dating behavior and what does a real relationship look like. And they're also teaching the young men, you know, because if you haven't been taught that at home, where would you learn it? And until you've done something wrong. But it's also the people around who hear it, and whether that's in the classroom or in the office. If you're complicit with it and you know about it, obviously that's a problem too. So it's such an interesting time right now. I'm fascinated to see how this all turns out. Hopefully it happens in my lifetime.
and you know, I have to say that many male students have come to me and say, you know, gosh, what do I do? Can we flirt anymore? Can we do, you know, what am I supposed to do? And I said, well, especially in the workplace. You know, they said, you know, for example, in theater, I had one student come to me and say, you know, in theater, everybody hugs each other. And I said, let the woman lead. You know, don't come up and you know, if you are the director of the show and you have the power and you don't come up and give her a hug, let her come and instigate that if it's an after the show hug. And try it so you take a step back and let the woman lead. You know, level out the power if you can, just in that small thing. And he was grateful.
And how is the political climate affecting things right now with all?
Oh gosh, don't get me started.
I want to start with the person in the White House who's tweeting out horrible messages, even yesterday, about a Senator Gillibrand, and that somehow she's, you know, as a woman, I don't even know how he thinks or how he comes up with this. But it's embarrassing, and it's obviously starting at the White House. So we have a lot of work to do all the way down. Mm-hmm.
Well, at least anecdotally in the last year, there has been an angst in the air, I would say, and the level of anxiety that we have seen an increase in terms of concerns being brought to our office, and not just on disclosures of incidents, but people just feeling like, is that okay? And sort of still processing things, and hearing certain emboldened, maybe other students in the classroom saying things that is not only offensive, but also kind of drives these conversations around consent, for instance, and what constitutes consent. And so I think that there are more, I don't know, stark, authentic conversations perhaps in the classroom that could be triggering, and just watching TV and seeing what's going on in the political climate has prompted some individuals to come to our office and say, you know, if we're hearing that this is, if we're seeing that it's okay, so then was that my fault, right? So it's a lot of this still processing and trying to reconcile their own experiences with what they're seeing on the national front. And so that's part of these conversations that we'll continue to have and need to have. And I think your question earlier about how gender plays into all this, the notions of gender, is so important, because I think that, you know, there have been numerous studies just about that power dynamic, especially in the workplace. And so, and we're seeing it right now just on the national scale of the most powerful person in the free world, right? So.
And 10 to 20 years ago, we didn't have, or it wasn't talked about as much as it is now. Do you think women tolerate things less in the workplace and maybe have more, like we said, power in numbers to come forward now, or kind of are finding their voice and knowing that it's not okay to put up with this kind of behavior?
I think what's changed is social media, and that's one great thing. I mean, I come from a long line of feminists, and I think, you know, I always tell my students that I stand on the women before me, that I'm here in this position because of my mother and my grandmother and many women that fought before for different, you know, for these types of issues and many other issues. However, I think what's hopeful is that this generation now has social media. The Me Too movement couldn't have been on in any other way. It couldn't have gone global as fast. We have the technology. So that's thrilling to me. I would be interested to see what my colleagues here think too.
Please.
I was just going to say that when the campus sexual assault stuff started again more recently, that I had women come to me and say, well, this was happening on campus 50 years ago and no one cared, and, you know, boys will be boys. And so it's interesting. Yes, I do hope that we're all coming together now. We are feeling more empowered, especially as dynamics change. You know, there are more women in the workplace. Even when I was growing up, I went to college in the early 80s. I mean, there just weren't that many women working yet, especially not working and not having families. So there are more women out there, and women have to support one another. So I think, you know, our whole dynamic of our culture is changing, and hopefully with that, these positive changes. Because I know, unfortunately, I know a lot of older men who just don't understand that what they're saying is a problem and still say it. And at some point in your life, you decide how you're going to deal with that. And most of my life, I've laughed it off or made a joke about it. But the fact is a lot of offensive things have been said to me, and assumptions have been made as to how I got where I got or doing what I'm doing. And that needs to change. And hopefully young men will understand it's not okay to ask someone if you slept with the boss to get your job. I mean, you don't say that. And I've heard those comments since I was in my 20s. So hopefully that's changed or changing.
Does training help? Do you think
Definitively, yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. And I would say, you know, I wish, and I always, the majority of my classes are about 85% women and about 15% men. And what I think is that there needs to be a shift, and more men need to come in and take these classes. And what I always say to the men is, you get a rare opportunity to listen to how women really think and talk when you're not around, when they don't exist for you, when they're not trying to impress you. And every one of my male students after the class, and there's usually maybe 3 out of 40, or, you know, come up and say, I really didn't understand some things, but now I do, because they've talked and you've created this safe environment. And we talk about these issues that we kind of, as men, kind of are trained to ignore.
I think training is important, and for it to be effective, it can't just be the online 1 hour I'm going to sit in front of the click away.
Yes.
It's these kinds of conversations that they're having in classrooms, and what we're doing right now is to really elevate this beyond just, okay, I'm clicking through the nuts and bolts and not really understanding the nuances, because when this comes up, it's, you know, a very natural sort of interaction where you're like, someone says a comment that you're like, you know, is that my boundary? Is that their boundary? And I think what I like to underscore is we do a campus climate survey on sexual misconduct every 2 years, and consistently the responses about why someone doesn't report and talk about it is because they didn't feel it was a big deal. right? Or they had more important things to do. And those are some of the responses. These are from students, right? We've got students that are here, first-gen students trying to get through their education and just going, I'm going to push that aside for right now. I got to get through the semester. I got to get through final exams right now. And so I'll deal with that later. And by the time I deal with that later, it's like, okay, now is anyone even going to believe me? Because this was a month ago, a year ago. And so these are all the things that I think underscore the fact that it perpetuates marginalization of certain individuals as well, because it's not just women, right? Tons of studies around how this affects the LGBTQ community, right? Individuals with disabilities who don't want to further stigmatize their own communities. So these sort of intersectional kinds of conversations are part of the reason why Me Too is happening and other types of movements, that people are talking about it more because it's something that they're recognizing as part of their lived experiences.
This is actually my final question, and it's to everyone. What can we expect now, and what is next?
It's interesting because I've seen some hashtags over the last couple of days that say, Me Too, now what, right? And I think we're in that time where, what is going to happen next, and how do we culturally adjust? I think a lot of it's training and understanding. And I think a lot of people reading what's happened, you know, with Senator Franken, and you're like, wow, I did that before. And, you know, so applying it to your own life and understanding that some of that casual behavior is really, really very dangerous.
Again, I think just continuing these conversations. I saw an article recently about someone who tweeted, a man who had tweeted support for the Me Too movement and said, what do men do? How can men be a part of this? And the response from one journalist, she gave a whole list of, and it's gone viral. It was so wonderful, but she gave a list of what men can do. And again, it's not vilifying men, but it's really being mindful of the fact that the majority of perpetrators are men, right? And so how do we speak to perpetration and not just survivor support after something has happened, and being really proactive about it? And that's even tackling notions of gender, masculinity, and things like that. Because, oh, well, you know, how about at meetings in the workplace, making sure that women don't feel like they have to take a back seat to a man speaking up, right? Recruitment efforts around getting women and minorities more involved and having inclusive climate. All of that is a spectrum of behaviors that sets up a climate for saying that these kinds of sexual harassing behaviors are unacceptable. So it's really looking at it holistically and not just saying there's one incident where someone kept asking someone out even though they said no. It's not that simple. So I think what we're seeing is a culture change, and if you really want that to continue, then it has to be a pervasive culture change and a frame of mind for all gender identities, all sexual orientations, and just everybody at the table, whether it's in the workplace or in the classroom. And so just paying attention to these things and knowing it's a larger picture than just one incident in the workplace.
I absolutely agree. I think we can do better. I think we can have higher expectations of men. I think we can believe women, and working with young people and caring deeply about their lives. Remembering, I think for us older people, is to remember how young and hopeful we all start out, and to keep that hope alive.
Thank you so much. That's all the time we have. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Yeah, you're welcome.
Right, thanks.
Thank you for watching On Point. You can follow us on social media at CSUN On Point. You can hear us at KCSN 88.5 FM on Sunday mornings at 5:30. You can watch us on Santa Clarita Valley Television on Sundays at 5 and on LA 36 at 8:30 Friday mornings. For all of us here at On Point, I'm Lauren Turner Dunn.